My name is Madeline Ward. I am 23 years old, a forensic accountant in Houston, Texas, and a woman who learned that family loyalty is a transaction I can no longer afford. 4 months ago, I sat in a sweltering university auditorium in Austin, staring at three empty folding chairs in the fourth row. I was wearing a cheap graduation gown that felt like a sauna. I had paid for my degree by working graveyard shifts analyzing corporate ledgers and surviving on 4 hours of sleep. I had saved those three seats for my parents, Richard and Sylvia, and my older sister, Victoria. When the dean called my name, I walked across the stage to the sound of other families screaming and blowing air horns. My section was entirely silent. That night, I did not receive an apology. I received a notification. I opened my phone and saw a photo my mother had posted 30 minutes earlier. She was standing in an exclusive bridal boutique in Dallas, holding a crystal champagne flute. Victoria was standing on a velvet pedestal wearing a $20,000 imported silk gown. My father was beaming in the background, holding his platinum credit card. The caption read, "Only the best for our perfect bride." They had not forgotten my graduation. They had actively chosen to be 300 miles away, buying a dress while I received my diploma. What they did not know was that while they were sipping champagne, I was unlocking the filing cabinet in their home office. I found the legal portfolio my late grandfather left behind. I found the forged signatures and the wire transfers. They skipped my graduation because they were too busy liquidating my $3 million inheritance to fund a high society lie. They thought I would stay quiet. They thought I would be the submissive daughter they had trained me to be. But my grandfather was a Texas oilman who despised thieves, and he had left a trap waiting for them. Before I tell you how a single clause in a blind trust destroyed their lives, please take a second to hit the like and subscribe buttons, but only if you believe in the power of undeniable proof. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to the afternoon. Those three chairs stayed empty and the ledger of my family was permanently closed. The drive from the university campus in Austin back to my cramped apartment took 20 minutes. I tossed my graduation cap onto the passenger seat of my 10-year-old sedan. The air conditioning was struggling against the Texas heat, making the vinyl seats burn against my legs. While my family was likely toasting to their own manufactured prestige, I was sweating in gridlocked traffic on Interstate 35. The stark contrast was not new. It was the heavily engineered blueprint of our entire family dynamic. My older sister Victoria was the golden investment. When she wanted to move to Los Angeles to pursue an acting career, my parents paid her exorbitant rent for 3 years. When she got tired of auditioning and moved back to Texas, they bought her a luxury SUV as a welcome home gift. When I turned 18, I told my father I wanted to study forensic accounting and data analytics. He looked at me over his morning coffee and told me it sounded like a miserable career for someone lacking ambition. He informed me that he would not finance a degree that offered no social return on his investment. I was cut off immediately. No tuition help, no rent assistance. They assumed I would fail without their guidance. They assumed I would crawl back and accept a mundane job they deemed appropriate for the less capable child. They miscalculated the resilience required to analyze thousands of data points in the middle of the night. I pulled into the cramped parking lot of my apartment complex. I unlocked my door and tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter. I bypassed the tiny kitchen and sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop to check my email, expecting nothing. Instead, the first thing on my screen was my mother's latest social media post. The photo of Victoria in her bridal gown glowing under the boutique lights. The timestamp confirmed they were standing in Dallas, exactly when I was standing on stage in Austin. I absorbed the visual data. I did not draft a desperate text demanding to know why they chose a dress fitting over my graduation. I recognized the reality. Victoria was the golden child, and I was the invisible utility. The betrayal catalyzed a shift in my psyche. The lingering ghost of the people-pleasing daughter evaporated, replaced entirely by the cold surgical detachment of a forensic accountant. I decided right then to drive back to my childhood home to pack my remaining documents. I wanted my birth certificate, my tax records, and my old journals. I wanted to sever the final physical ties and relocate to Houston, where a corporate auditing firm had just offered me a lucrative entry-level position. I was completely unaware that the empty graduation chairs were merely the cover for a much larger financial crime. I sat at my laminate desk, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. I did not just look at the first image. I swiped through the entire curated gallery Sylvia had uploaded to her social media feed. The visual data provided a flawless chronological timeline of their weekend. The first photo showed Victoria standing on a circular velvet pedestal. The silk gown draped around her was an imported design. I knew the brand from the financial audits I ran on luxury retail portfolios during my coursework. The starting price for that specific cut was $20,000. Victoria was holding a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. Her reflection multiplied in the endless floor-to-ceiling mirrors of the Dallas boutique. The second photo featured Richard and Sylvia standing on either side of their golden child. Richard wore his tailored golf blazer, offering a practiced, polished smile to the camera. His hand was resting on the boutique counter near the register. The edge of his platinum credit card was visible. Sylvia had captioned the gallery with a single line reading, "Only the best for our perfect bride." I checked the timestamps on the digital uploads. The boutique was a 3-hour drive north of my university. To be standing in that fitting room drinking champagne, they had to leave their house on Friday night. They drove away from my graduation venue the evening before the ceremony even started. I rested my hands on the edge of my desk. A year ago, this visual evidence would have shattered my composure. The old version of Madeline would have drafted a long, emotional text message begging to know why my milestone was ignored. I would have asked what I did wrong to earn such disregard. I would have tried to bargain for a fraction of the attention they showered on Victoria. But sitting in the stifling heat of my apartment, that people-pleasing instinct flatlined. My brain shifted into the exact framework I used for corporate auditing. I stopped viewing them as a family unit and started viewing them as a mismanaged organization. Victoria was not just a daughter to Richard and Sylvia. She was a calculated acquisition strategy. My parents operated their lives like a public relations firm, desperate to secure a permanent seat in Texas high society. Victoria was their premier asset. She possessed the curated aesthetic they valued. She was currently engaged to Preston, a man actively grooming himself for a seat in the state legislature. Marrying Victoria into Preston's wealthy political family was the ultimate merger for my parents. They poured every ounce of their energy and capital into maintaining her flawless image. They viewed my career in forensic accounting as a tedious subordinate role. Richard had explicitly told me that auditing was a profession for people who lacked the charisma to build real wealth. He despised auditors because they dealt in concrete facts, and Richard built his entire existence on smoke and mirrors. I analyzed ledgers in the dark while Victoria posed for the cameras. I was the invisible scaffolding they ignored until they needed a structural problem fixed. I closed the photo application. The screen went dark, reflecting my own face. My expression was perfectly neutral. The sorrow was eradicated, replaced by the clean, sterile efficiency of a ledger closing out. I stood up from my desk and grabbed my car keys. If I was going to accept my role as a ghost, I needed to sever the final administrative ties holding me to their household. I was scheduled to relocate to Houston the following week to begin my new corporate position. I needed my birth certificate, my passport, and my original tax documents. They were stored in the locked gray filing cabinet in my father's home office. I walked out to the parking lot and started my sedan. The drive from my low-income student housing to their suburban estate took 45 minutes. The physical journey mirrored the psychological divide between my reality and their delusion. I merged onto the highway, leaving the crowded university grid behind. I drove past the strip malls and the industrial parks, navigating toward the wealthy enclaves carved into the Texas hillsides. The transition into their gated community was a stark geographical shift. I turned onto their private street. The neighborhood was a monument to unearned arrogance. The properties featured sweeping stone facades, manicured drought-resistant lawns, and excessive security lighting. I pulled my aging car into their wide circular driveway. The property was entirely silent. The heavy wooden garage doors were shut, indicating both of their luxury vehicles were still parked at a hotel in Dallas for the bridal weekend. I stepped out of the car. The midday sun beat down on the concrete driveway, but I felt a distinct chill as I approached the front porch. I used the old brass key they had given me in high school. The heavy front door swung open on silent hinges. The air inside the house was crisp, chilled by a central cooling system running at full capacity despite the residence being empty. The foyer smelled of lemon polish and expensive floral diffusers. It was the scent of manufactured perfection. I walked across the polished travertine tile. The silence in the house was profound. The walls of the main hallway were lined with custom-framed photographs. There was Victoria holding a silver trophy from a prestigious equestrian competition. There was Victoria wearing a diamond tiara at a sorority gala. There was Richard and Sylvia shaking hands with local politicians at a country club fundraiser. I walked past 30 distinct photographs. My face did not appear in a single frame. The visual erasure was meticulous and deliberate. They had curated the physical space of their home to reflect the exact same narrative they pushed on social media. I was a minor footnote in the story of their success, an inconvenient reality they cropped out of the frame. I reached the end of the hallway and placed my hand on the brass doorknob of my father's home office. The room was Richard's sanctuary. It was designed to intimidate anyone who walked through the door. The walls were lined with dark walnut bookshelves displaying leather-bound volumes he never actually read. A heavy mahogany executive desk was positioned in the center of the room facing the doorway like a judge's bench. I stepped into the office and closed the door behind me. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, casting the room in long gray shadows. My objective was simple and clinical. I wanted to extract my identification documents, pack them into my canvas bag, and drive away before the sun set. I wanted the transaction to be silent and untraceable. I did not want to leave a note. I did not want a dramatic confrontation. I walked around the heavy leather chair and knelt on the carpet in front of the metal filing cabinet tucked beneath the window. I expected to find old medical records and standard household receipts. I believed I was just executing a quiet, emotional departure. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold metal handle of the bottom drawer. I was entirely unaware that by pulling that handle I was stepping directly into the epicenter of a multi-million-dollar federal crime. The metal handle of the bottom drawer was cold against my skin. I pulled it outward, and the steel tracks glided open with a quiet mechanical hiss. The drawer was meticulously organized. My father categorized his life with the same rigid control he applied to his public image. Heavy manila folders were aligned in perfect alphabetical order. I bypassed the sections labeled for household maintenance and vehicle registrations. I flipped through the stiff paper tabs until I reached the personal identification files. I located my birth certificate and my social security card tucked inside a thin plastic sleeve. I slid the documents into my canvas bag. The objective was complete. I was prepared to close the drawer and drive to Houston. But as I shifted my weight on the carpet, my knee bumped the front of the metal cabinet. A stack of files shifted near the very back of the compartment, revealing a false panel resting against the steel frame. My training as an auditor taught me to look for anomalies. People who hide things always leave a structural inconsistency. I reached past the standard tax returns and pulled the false panel forward. Tucked behind it was a thick, leather-bound legal portfolio. It did not match the mundane office supplies in the rest of the cabinet. The leather was worn and stamped with the gold foil seal of a premier estate law firm based in West Texas. I recognized the name of the firm immediately. It was the legal counsel retained by my late grandfather, William. To understand the weight of that leather portfolio, you have to understand the man who commissioned it. Grandpa William was a pragmatist built from West Texas oil dirt. He made his fortune identifying dry wells and turning them into high-yield assets. He wore faded denim and possessed hands calloused by decades of manual labor. He despised my father. William viewed Richard as a hollow suit, a man who spent his days networking on manicured golf courses while producing nothing of actual value. William observed our family dynamics with a sharp, uncompromising eye. He watched Richard and Sylvia groom Victoria for high society while treating me like an indentured servant. During the final years of his life, William rarely spoke at family dinners. He simply sat at the end of the table, taking mental inventory of the rot spreading through his bloodline. He recognized my grit. He saw me working graveyard shifts and studying data models. I rested the heavy portfolio on my knees and unclasped the metal binding. I opened the cover expecting to find old property deeds or outdated wills. Instead, the first page displayed a bold header outlining the establishment of an irrevocable blind trust. I scanned the legal parameters, reading the dense financial terminology with practiced speed. The principal sum deposited into the trust was $3 million. The beneficiary listed on the second page was Madeline Ward. My breath caught in the quiet chill of the home office. $3 million. It was a sum of capital that alters the entire trajectory of a human life. It was a permanent shield against the kind of financial scarcity my parents had used to control me. But Grandpa William was a strategist. He knew if he handed me that capital while I was a teenager, Richard would find a way to coerce me into signing it away. My father would have used the money to cover his speculative real estate debts or fund Victoria's luxury aesthetic. So William engineered a safeguard. He utilized a blind trust structure, placing the funds behind a pane of bulletproof legal glass. The document detailed a highly specific vesting clause. The capital would remain entirely inaccessible until the exact day I completed a 4-year university degree. My graduation ceremony was not just an academic milestone, it was a financial trigger. The realization hit me with the force of a physical strike. They did not skip my graduation to attend a dress fitting. They skipped my graduation because acknowledging the day meant acknowledging the execution of the trust. I turned the thick parchment pages, moving past the original estate parameters to examine the attached banking ledgers. As a forensic accountant, I do not read numbers. I read human behavior translated into mathematics. I looked at the balance summary located at the top of the most recent page. The account did not hold $3 million. The current available balance was zero. Balance. I traced my finger down the itemized columns auditing the capital flight. The theft was not executed in a single transaction. It was a systematic, deliberate bleed spanning the last 90 days. The ledger documented a staggering timeline of unearned luxury. There was a wire transfer for $50,000 routed to a premier event planner in Dallas. There was an $80,000 withdrawal marked for a luxury auto dealership. There were multiple six-figure transfers funneled directly into a commercial real estate holding company that I knew my father controlled. They were using my inheritance to prop up Richard's failing investments and pay for Victoria's country club wedding. The money was gone, evaporated into the Texas heat to maintain a fabricated illusion of wealth. To liquidate a blind trust prior to the vesting date requires rigorous administrative override. I flipped to the final section of the portfolio. I needed to see the mechanism they used to breach the accounts. I found a formal release authorization printed on heavy bond paper. The document claimed the beneficiary was experiencing severe cognitive distress and requested an emergency dissolution of the trust to cover medical expenses. It was a perjury trap designed to bypass the estate lawyers. At the bottom of the page, resting on the signature line, was my name. The ink was black. The cursive loops were slanted slightly to the right. I stared at the signature, analyzing the pressure marks and the hesitation points in the pen strokes. It was a masterful forgery, but it lacked my natural cadence. I recognized the distinct handwriting immediately. It was my mother's penmanship. Sylvia had sat at this very mahogany desk and forged my identity to steal my future. Beside the forged signature was a bright red notary stamp, validating the fraudulent document. I read the name on the stamp. It belonged to a local real estate broker who played in Richard's weekly golf foursome. The crime was a collaborative effort. I was kneeling on the carpet, holding undeniable proof of grand larceny, wire fraud, and identity theft. The people who raised me had conspired to strip away my financial independence just to buy a silk gown and sustain their crumbling social status. I did not drop the portfolio. I did not break down in tears or scream at the empty walls. Grief is an emotion reserved for individuals who mourn a loss. I felt no loss. I only felt the cold, precise hum of an auditor uncovering a critical discrepancy. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I swiped the screen to activate the camera. I checked the settings, ensuring the flash was disabled and the resolution was set to maximum clarity. I smoothed the release authorization flat against the carpet. I held my phone steady above the document framing the forged signature and the corrupt notary stamp. I tapped the screen. The digital shutter clicked, capturing the felony in high definition. I turned the page to the banking ledgers. I photographed the itemized wire transfers, making sure the routing numbers and the receiving accounts were perfectly legible. I captured the date stamps, proving the funds were liquidated before my graduation ceremony even began. I photographed the original estate parameters, documenting the $3 million principal and my grandfather's explicit instructions. I spent 12 minutes systematically digitizing the entire legal portfolio. I built an airtight case file right there on the floor of my father's sanctuary. When every page was secured in my encrypted cloud storage, I closed the leather cover. I returned the portfolio to the exact position I found it, sliding it behind the false panel. I stacked the mundane tax returns in front of the compartment, restoring the drawer to its original meticulous condition. I pushed the metal compartment shut and the steel tracks clicked softly into place. I stood up and brushed the dust from my knees. I looked around the shadowed home office. Richard and Sylvia believed they had executed the perfect crime. They believed their quiet, invisible daughter would never question the sudden influx of wealth funding Victoria's opulent lifestyle. They thought my compliance was a permanent condition. They failed to realize that the girl they starved for affection had grown into a woman who specialized in dismantling financial lies. I walked out of the office and pulled the heavy front door shut behind me. I stepped into the blinding Texas sunlight, carrying my canvas bag and a digital arsenal capable of destroying their entire world. I walked to my aging sedan and started the engine. I merged onto the highway, pointing my car south toward Houston. I was not just driving toward a new corporate job. I was heading to my fortress to prepare a battlefield. I would sit in the quiet air conditioning of my new life and wait for their stolen capital to run dry. And when they inevitably came looking for more, I would be ready. I steered my sedan onto Interstate 45, heading south toward the sprawling concrete grid of Houston. The digital files were safely locked behind dual encryption on my remote server. I did not take a single physical piece of paper from the mahogany desk. Stealing a tangible document triggers an immediate defensive response. It alerts the adversary that the perimeter is breached and prompts them to hide their remaining assets. I wanted Richard and Sylvia to feel secure in their felony. I wanted them to sleep soundly, believing their secret was buried under years of tax returns. As the city limits of Dallas faded in my rearview mirror, I reached for my smartphone resting in the center console. I initiated a total information diet. I did not draft a dramatic farewell message outlining my grievances. I did not demand the return of my stolen inheritance. Warning: a parasite only grants it the necessary time to burrow deeper into the host. I opened my contact list and executed the protocol. I navigated to my father's name and pressed block. I repeated the action for my mother and then for Victoria. I scrubbed my social media profiles, untagging myself from old holiday photos and setting my privacy parameters to maximum restriction. I erased my digital footprint, severing the communication channels with surgical precision. By the time I crossed the Houston city limits, the invisible daughter they had discarded was officially unreachable. Houston is a city built on raw energy and corporate ambition. It does not care about your pedigree or your country club affiliations. It only respects output. I secured a junior associate position at a prestigious corporate auditing firm in the financial district. My colleagues were apex predators in tailored suits, specializing in dismantling fraudulent shell companies and exposing offshore tax evasions. I fit into their ecosystem perfectly. I channeled the betrayal of my bloodline into an unyielding professional drive. I spent the next 12 months working 80-hour weeks. I isolated myself in labyrinthine data models and complex financial compliance laws. While my peers spent their weekends at rooftop bars networking for lateral promotions, I sat in the silent glow of dual monitors, mapping out asset tracing protocols and forensic recovery strategies. I treated my career like a high-stakes training ground. Every fraudulent ledger I dissected for my corporate clients sharpened the exact skills I needed to eventually dismantle my own family. I specialized in uncovering hidden liabilities during corporate mergers. I learned how arrogant executives attempted to bury their bad debts under layers of subsidiary companies. I recognized the universal truth of financial crime. Greed always leaves a paper trail. People who steal capital are fundamentally incapable of hiding their spending habits because the entire purpose of the theft is to fund their vanity. The partners at the firm noticed my relentless precision. In corporate America, competence is the ultimate currency. I was promoted twice within a single calendar year, bypassing senior analysts who relied on office politics rather than concrete results. My salary skyrocketed, reflecting the tangible value I brought to the firm. I was generating legitimate wealth through my own intellect, while my parents were financing their existence on stolen time. With the influx of legitimate capital, I abandoned my cramped student housing and engineered a physical fortress to match my digital boundaries. I signed a lease on a penthouse apartment in a modern high-rise overlooking the Houston skyline. The space was a testament to raw, unvarnished reality. There were no heavy velvet curtains or dark mahogany cabinets hiding false panels. The perimeter was lined with floor-to-ceiling glass, allowing the harsh Texas sunlight to illuminate every square inch of the polished concrete floors. I furnished the space sparsely, prioritizing function and steel over plush comfort. It was a sterile, secure environment high above the chaotic noise of the city streets. I stood by the glass each evening, watching the headlights carve through the twilight, feeling a profound sense of isolation and power. I had built an empire using my own intellect, leaving the parasitic dynamics of my childhood miles behind. Despite the strict communication blackout, I kept a clinical eye on the suburban mansion I had left behind. In the modern age, you do not need to speak to someone to track their financial ruin. I utilized a secure, anonymous profile to monitor Sylvia's public social media feeds. She treated her page like a press release, broadcasting the liquidation of my inheritance in real time. I watched the $3 million bleed out through 1,000 self-inflicted cuts. The photographs documented an escalating spiral of Victoria's opulent aesthetic. Sylvia posted images of her golden child touring exclusive European wedding venues. There were pictures of custom-carved ice sculptures imported out of seasoned floral arrangements and a rotating fleet of luxury vehicles. Victoria did not just lease a car, she demanded a chauffeur-driven town car for her bridal errands. Richard uploaded updates about his expanding real estate portfolio, boasting about acquiring prime commercial lots. Sylvia hosted weekly catered luncheons at the country club, leaving extravagant tips to ensure the waitstaff treated her like royalty. To the untrained eye, they looked like a dynasty cementing its legacy. But as a forensic auditor, I saw the underlying math. I calculated their monthly burn rate using the visual evidence they so generously provided to the public. $3 million is a substantial amount of capital, but it is finite. When you factor in the exorbitant overhead required to maintain a high society illusion, the principal depletes at an exponential rate. They were spending stolen liquid cash to finance depreciating assets and temporary vanity projects. They were not generating new revenue. They were simply burning through the stolen fuel to keep their hot air balloon aloft. American society operates on a strict ledger. You cannot finance an illusion forever. Eventually, the creditors call the debts, the vendors demand cash up front, and the banks initiate audits. I knew the exact trajectory of their financial flight path. They were heading for a spectacular crash, and they had no idea the ground was rushing up to meet them. I bided my time in the quiet, clinical silence of my high-rise fortress. I focused on my corporate accounts and let the months tick by. I did not need to intervene or sabotage their wedding plans. Their own insatiable greed was doing the heavy lifting for me. I simply waited for the inevitable moment when the stolen capital ran dry, the facade began to crack, and the parasites realized they needed to hunt for a new host to drain. 14 months is the exact lifespan of 3 million stolen dollars when managed by amateurs playing a high society game. I tracked the final depletion from my high-rise office in Houston. The visual indicators on Sylvia's social media slowed down and then shifted in tone. The exclusive European venue tours vanished from her feed. The posts about imported floral arrangements were replaced by recycled photos from the previous summer. The burn rate had officially outpaced the stolen principal. Victoria's wedding had mutated into an unfunded liability. She had signed vendor contracts under the assumption that the trust fund was a bottomless well. Now the elite caterers required final deposits, and the bespoke designers in Dallas were holding her silk gowns hostage pending full payment. Her luxury aesthetic demanded a continuous stream of cash, and the reservoir was dry. Richard faced a much darker reality. My father operated his commercial real estate ventures on strict margin. He purchased overpriced suburban lots using heavy leverage, assuming he could flip them to commercial developers before the balloon payments came due. But the zoning boards delayed his building permits, and the Texas real estate market corrected. Without my inheritance to act as his personal slush fund, his properties became dead weight. He was holding acres of empty dirt while the banks calculated the compounding interest. The creditors were calling, and the social facade was crumbling under the weight of actual mathematics. I sat in my corner office on a Tuesday afternoon reviewing a compliance audit for a technology merger. The air conditioning hummed a steady low rhythm. The Houston skyline stretched out beyond my floor to ceiling windows bathed in the harsh afternoon sun. My personal digital borders were impermeable. My smartphone blocked their numbers, and my private email routed their domains directly to the trash bin. I was unreachable. Richard realized he could not penetrate my personal defenses, so he decided to exploit my professional visibility. A notification appeared on my secondary monitor. It was an email routed directly to my official corporate address at the auditing firm. The sender name was unfamiliar. I ran a quick search on the domain name and recognized it immediately. It belonged to the holding company my father managed. My father had outsourced his extortion. He ordered a junior associate, an entry-level employee, likely terrified of losing his job, to bypass my security parameters and deliver the payload. It was a cowardly tactic utilizing a subordinate to breach a boundary he lacked the courage to cross himself. I clicked the subject line. It read, "Urgent Family Update." The body of the message was written with a sickening level of artificial warmth. Richard dictated a greeting that sounded like a casual check-in from a loving patriarch. He asked how the Houston weather was treating me. He mentioned that Sylvia missed my presence at their Sunday dinners. He typed the words with the same practiced charm he used on the golf course, attempting to build rapport before closing a predatory deal. Then the tone executed a sharp pivot into desperation. Richard explained that the family was facing a temporary liquidity crisis. He blamed the shifting real estate market and unexpected vendor inflation for Victoria's ballooning wedding budget. He claimed they just needed a short-term financial bridge to cross the gap and secure their investments. He framed the disaster not as a consequence of grand larceny, but as a routine cash flow interruption. He directed my attention to the attached document. I dragged the cursor over the file and opened the PDF. It was a commercial loan application from a secondary lending institution known for issuing high-risk debt. I analyzed the terms with the practiced eye of a forensic auditor. The principal requested was a staggering sum designed to cover the wedding deficit and halt the foreclosure proceedings on his commercial lots. The annual percentage rate was predatory. The amortization schedule was designed to keep the borrower trapped in a cycle of crushing interest payments for a decade. Richard did not have the credit score or the verifiable liquid assets to secure the loan himself. The underwriting department required a guarantor. They needed a co-signer with an immaculate financial profile, a top-tier corporate salary, and zero existing debt. They needed a verified asset to balance their risk. They needed me. The audacity of the request paralyzed the room for a fraction of a second. I sat in my ergonomic chair and stared at the digital paperwork. The man who forged my signature to steal $3 million was now demanding I use my own verifiable income to co-sign a predatory loan. He wanted me to cover the very deficit his felony had created. He expected me to leverage my future, my pristine credit, and my corporate standing to finance the cover-up of his theft. The email concluded with a thinly veiled threat. Richard stated that if I refused to sign the guarantor application, the wedding would be canceled. He warned that the ensuing public disgrace would fall squarely on my shoulders. He claimed that failing to support my sister in her hour of need would prove I was the bitter, ungrateful daughter they always suspected me to be. He tried to weaponize my guilt, assuming I still cared about their approval. I did not feel anger. Anger requires a lingering emotional investment. I felt a cold, analytical amusement. My father was holding a loaded gun to his own head and threatening to pull the trigger if I did not buy him a new suit. He assumed blood obligation would override logic. He believed the threat of social shame would force me to open my ledger and absorb his ruin. He forgot that I was an auditor who viewed social shame as an irrelevant metric. I did not draft a long defense of my character. I did not point out the glaring hypocrisy of a thief asking his victim for a financial bailout. I did not ask him where the original $3 million had gone. I placed my hands on the keyboard and typed a single definitive response. The ledger is closed. I hit send. The transmission was instantaneous. I did not stop there. In corporate America, you document every anomaly. I downloaded the email chain, the routing data, and the attached loan application. I compiled the documents into a secure file and forwarded the entire packet to the head of my firm's Cybersecurity and Human Resources division. I drafted a formal internal report documenting targeted harassment from an external corporate entity. I detailed how an executive at a real estate holding company was utilizing company servers and junior personnel to harass a licensed auditor at our firm. I requested a corporate block on their entire domain. I ensured there was an immutable paper trail proving my father was attempting to compromise my professional standing. The firm's security team executed the block within 10 minutes, locking Richard out of my corporate life permanently. I closed the email application and returned to the tech merger file on my desk. The digital boundary was reinforced. My fortress remained impenetrable. But I knew the psychology of the people who raised me. When a parasite is denied access to the host, it does not simply starve quietly. It thrashes. Deprived of a financial lifeline and locked out of private communication channels, they would inevitably resort to the only currency they had left. Sylvia would view my refusal as a declaration of war. I looked out the window at the Texas sun reflecting off the glass towers. I knew they were preparing to weaponize their social network to launch a public character assassination. They were about to take the battle into the public square entirely unaware that I held the ultimate ammunition. The digital block I established at the auditing firm held secure. Richard's attempt to manipulate me through my professional inbox failed, leaving him staring at the concrete reality of his ruined investments. But Richard was not the architect of our family's social standing. That role belonged entirely to Sylvia. Sylvia had spent 2 decades meticulously curating her image within the affluent circles of Dallas. She was a fixture at charity galas, country club luncheons, and exclusive fundraising boards. She built a network of acquaintances who dealt in perception rather than substance. When Richard informed her that I had closed the ledger and refused to co-sign the predatory loan, Sylvia realized the Bank of Madeline was permanently shuttered. Narcissists operate on a predictable timeline. When they lose direct control over a target, they pivot to controlling how the world perceives that target. Denied her financial lifeline, Sylvia resorted to public character assassination. On a Thursday morning, my phone buzzed with an alert from a junior colleague at my firm. She had sent a screenshot with a single question asking if I had seen what was circulating online. I opened the image. It was a still frame from a video Sylvia had posted across multiple social platforms. The video was a masterclass in theatrical manipulation. Sylvia was seated in her expansive sunlit living room wearing a modest cashmere sweater. Her hair was perfectly styled, but her makeup was deliberately minimal to convey a sense of exhaustion and grief. I watched the video in the quiet of my office. Sylvia did not scream or hurl insults. She spoke in a soft, trembling voice, weaponizing vulnerability. She spun a devastating narrative claiming that our family was facing an unexpected severe medical crisis. She intentionally left the details vague, allowing the audience to imagine the worst. She painted a picture of aging parents struggling to manage mounting healthcare costs while trying to provide a beautiful wedding for their eldest daughter. Then she executed this pivot. She turned the focus to me. Sylvia claimed that I had recently secured a highly lucrative corporate position in Houston, but that the sudden influx of wealth had corrupted me. She described me as a cold, greedy sociopath who had turned her back on the family in their darkest hour. She wept, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, stating that I refused to offer even a fraction of my corporate salary to help them survive. She ended the broadcast with a direct appeal to her network, asking for prayers and strength as they navigated my heartless abandonment. The response was immediate and explosive. In high society, gossip is the primary currency, and Sylvia had just minted a fortune. The video garnered thousands of views within hours. The true danger of a smear campaign lies not in the initial lie, but in the mobilization of the enablers. In psychological terms, these enablers are known as flying monkeys, individuals who willingly do the narcissist's bidding without questioning the underlying facts. Sylvia's network swung into action with terrifying efficiency. Aunts, cousins, and country club matriarchs who had not spoken to me in years suddenly felt entitled to interject themselves into my life. They bypassed my personal phone blocks by targeting the one place I could not hide my professional networking profiles. My corporate pages were flooded with vitriol. The comments were ruthless. Aunt Marjorie, a woman whose entire existence revolved around hosting afternoon teas, accused me of elder abuse. A distant cousin who worked in real estate commented that I was a disgrace to the family name and demanded I open my checkbook to save Victoria's perfect day. The digital mob escalated the attack by sending direct messages to the senior partners at my auditing firm. They attempted to shame my employers, questioning how a prestigious financial institution could employ someone with such a profound lack of moral character. Sylvia believed the weight of this coordinated public humiliation would break me. She relied on the outdated blueprint of my childhood. She assumed I was still the fragile, people-pleasing girl who would shrink to avoid conflict. She thought the threat of professional embarrassment would force me to surrender, expecting me to wire the funds just to silence the digital onslaught. I sat in my ergonomic chair watching the hateful comments populate on my screen. I did not feel a spike in adrenaline. I did not feel the urge to draft a frantic defensive essay, pleading my case to people committed to misunderstanding me. As a forensic auditor, I understand that defending yourself against a lie only validates the premise of the accusation. Participating in an emotional screaming match is a losing strategy because it drags you down into the mud where the narcissist holds the advantage. I do not deal in emotion. I deal in concrete reality. I closed my professional networking profile and opened my encrypted cloud storage. I navigated to the folder containing the high-definition photographs I had taken on the floor of my father's home office. I reviewed the evidence, the forged release authorization bearing my mother's counterfeit signature, the corrupted notary stamp, the banking ledgers documenting the systematic extraction of $3 million, the wire transfer receipts showing the stolen funds flowing directly to luxury auto dealerships, bridal boutiques, and commercial real estate accounts. The narrative Sylvia had spun was a masterpiece of fiction, but fiction shatters upon impact with hard data. I compiled a clean, organized digital document. I arranged the images chronologically, creating an undeniable timeline. The document started with the original estate parameters, proving the existence and the conditions of the $3 million trust. It moved to the forged signature, then to the itemized ledger of their theft, and concluded with the visual proof of their luxury expenditures. I did not prepare a long emotional explanation. I drafted a single surgical sentence. They stole a $3 million inheritance to buy a wedding. Direct your complaints to the felons. I was preparing a strike that would utilize the exact same digital platform Sylvia had weaponized against me. I was not just going to clear my name. I was going to detonate their manufactured reputation, incinerating their standing in Texas high society permanently. The trap was set, and I was about to force them to choke on their own curated lies. I sat in my Houston penthouse, entirely unbothered by the digital mob raging across my professional networking profiles. The vitriol flowing from my aunt's cousins and my mother's country club acquaintances was meant to break my spirit. It was designed to trigger a frantic emotional response, forcing me to capitulate and hand over the funds just to stop the public humiliation. But a forensic auditor does not negotiate with terrorists, and they certainly do not respond to hysteria. I operate in concrete reality. I opened my encrypted cloud storage, navigating past the files from my corporate clients and locating the secure folder marked with my grandfather's initials. The high-definition photographs I had taken on the floor of my father's home office loaded onto my dual monitors. The evidence was pristine. The forged release authorization bearing my mother's counterfeit signature stared back at me. The corrupted notary stamp was clearly legible. The banking ledgers documenting the systematic extraction of $3 million were laid bare, tracing the capital flight from the trust directly into the hands of luxury auto dealerships and Dallas bridal boutiques. I did not draft a long defensive essay explaining my position. I did not engage in the emotional screaming match my mother had initiated. Defending yourself against a lie only validates the premise of the accusation. I was preparing a surgical counterstrike. I compiled the visual evidence into a clean, undeniable digital document. I arranged the images chronologically, creating a timeline that even the most obtuse relative could not misinterpret. The document started with the original estate parameters proving the existence and the conditions of the $3 million trust. It established that the capital was designed to vest on the exact day of my university graduation. The next page displayed the forged signature authorizing the premature liquidation of the account. The final section documented the itemized wire transfers, matching the extracted funds down to the cent, with the exorbitant vendors Sylvia had flaunted on her social media feed over the past 14 months. I did not broadcast this document to the public. Broadcasting suggests a desire for general sympathy. I wanted targeted destruction. I reviewed the comments on my professional profile, identifying the 10 most vocal instigators of the harassment. Aunt Marjorie, who had accused me of elder abuse, was at the top of the list. A prominent country club matriarch who had demanded I open my checkbook to save Victoria's perfect day was second. I drafted a direct message to each of the 10 individuals. I attached the compiled PDF file containing the unassailable proof of felony grand larceny, wire fraud, and identity theft. I did not add any conversational padding. I did not ask for their understanding or their apologies. I typed a single devastating sentence. They stole a $3 million inheritance to buy a wedding. Direct your complaints to the felons. I hit send 10 times. The transmissions were instantaneous. The impact of delivering raw, verified data into a network built entirely on perception is nuclear. High society in Texas operates on a very specific code of conduct. They tolerate infidelity, substance abuse, and quiet bankruptcies as long as the veneer of respectability is maintained. They do not tolerate blatant, undeniable criminality. Grand larceny is not a social faux pas. It is a contagion, and people with old money etiquette run from contagions. The reaction was immediate. Within 30 minutes, the aggressive comments on my professional networking profiles began to disappear. Aunt Marjorie deleted her accusations. The distant cousins who had called me a disgrace erased their digital footprints. The flying monkeys realized they had been weaponized to defend a lie. Worse, they realized that while they were sending me hateful messages, I possessed the concrete evidence of my parents' depravity. The Whisper network turned on Sylvia instantly. The tearful, perfectly edited videos claiming I had abandoned the family during a medical crisis were quietly removed from her social media feeds by the end of the afternoon. The narrative she had spun to isolate me was incinerated. She had tried to squeeze me from the outside and believing the weight of community disapproval would force my hand. Instead, she handed me the exact audience I needed to execute her social execution. The isolation she intended for me became her own permanent reality. Sylvia was no longer asked to lead the charity luncheons. Her name was quietly struck from the country club fundraising boards. When she walked into the clubhouse, the other women shifted their gaze, avoiding eye contact. She had used their empathy to cover up her own theft, and they punished her with absolute silence. The family was socially exiled, cut off from the network they had sacrificed everything to maintain. The blast radius extended far beyond my parents' social calendar. The revelation of the stolen trust fund hit the core of Victoria's fabricated kingdom. Victoria was engaged to Preston, a man actively grooming himself for a seat in the Texas state legislature. Preston's family represented generational wealth and political influence. They had agreed to the merger believing the Ward family brought equal financial liquidity to the table. Preston's prospective in-laws did not rely on gossip. They operated like corporate sharks. When the Whisper network ignited with rumors of forged signatures and stolen inheritances, they did not ask Sylvia for clarification. They initiated their own quiet inquiries into Richard's commercial real estate holdings. They discovered the collapsed speculative investments and the impending foreclosure proceedings. They realized the Ward family was not just broke, they were toxic liabilities. Victoria's unearned prestige was evaporating. The luxury aesthetic she demanded was exposed as a hollow shell funded by my stolen future. The elite caterers demanding their final deposits began calling Preston's family, assuming they would cover the deficit. The bespoke designers in Dallas holding her silk gowns hostage threatened to cancel the orders entirely. Victoria could no longer hide behind her mother's enabling or her father's checkbook because both were bankrupt. I sat in my penthouse watching the sun set over the Houston skyline, feeling a profound sense of equilibrium. The universe always balances its books. My parents had chosen to invest everything into a lie, and they were now living with the returns of their bankruptcy. I had neutralized the generals and dismantled the smear campaign without ever raising my voice. But a parasite does not detach simply because the host cuts off the supply line. Desperation breeds a very specific type of audacity. I assumed the wedding would simply be canceled, and the drama would fade into the background of my corporate life. I forgot that the individuals who benefit the most from the abuse are often the most dangerous when the resources run dry. While Richard and Sylvia retreated into their humiliation, Preston realized his future political career was chained to a sinking ship. He was a pragmatist who liked the illusion of wealth Victoria provided, but he refused to absorb her family's debt. He recognized that I was the only person in the equation holding actual verified capital. Preston did not cancel the engagement gracefully. He decided to intervene, believing he could intimidate the quiet sister into submission. He was about to leave his comfortable political enclave and step directly into my territory, completely unaware that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. Preston was a product of generational wealth and manufactured political ambition. His family had spent decades cultivating a pristine conservative image within the Texas legislative districts, securing board seats and funding political action committees. Preston was currently serving his first term on a prominent city council, viewing the position merely as a stepping stone toward a state Senate campaign. He operated in a world where problems were solved through quiet intimidation, backroom deals, and leveraging influence. When the Whisper network turned against Sylvia, the fallout did not stay contained within the country club. The rumors of felony grand larceny seeped into Preston's political circles. His advisors initiated a quiet forensic background check on his future in-laws and discovered the truth. They realized the Ward family was not a strategic asset providing liquidity and social grace. They were a ticking time bomb of financial fraud. A rational man would have recognized the liability and severed the engagement immediately. But Preston was arrogant. He believed the rules of engagement that applied to ordinary citizens did not apply to him. He assumed he could manage the crisis by silencing the source of the leak. He viewed me not as an independent auditor, but as a minor inconvenience and estranged sister he could bully into submission to protect his own carefully curated public image. It was a Tuesday evening in Houston. The Gulf Coast humidity clung to the pavement as I walked out of the revolving glass doors of my corporate headquarters. I was carrying my leather briefcase, mentally reviewing an acquisition audit I needed to finalize before morning. The financial district was relatively quiet, the rush hour traffic having subsided an hour earlier. As I approached the crosswalk, a heavy black SUV with dark-tinted windows pulled aggressively against the curb, blocking my path to the pedestrian intersection. The engine idled with a low, powerful hum. The heavy door swung open and Preston stepped onto the concrete. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit, the fabric resisting the Houston heat. His posture was rigid, projecting the manufactured authority he used during city council meetings. He did not offer a greeting. He stepped directly into my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. Preston demanded that I get into the vehicle to have a private conversation. I stopped walking. I maintained a physical distance of 3 feet, recognizing the aggressive posturing. I did not raise my voice. I informed him that any conversation we needed to have could take place right there on the public sidewalk. Preston sneered his disdain for me, rolling off him in waves. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a harsh, commanding register. He stated that the rumors I had circulated regarding the inheritance were causing significant political friction for his campaign. He claimed my actions were reckless and damaging, not just to my parents, but to his future. To understand Preston's psychology, you have to understand the entitlement of a man who has never been told no. He believed he held unilateral authority over everyone in his orbit. He assumed my silence was a commodity he could simply purchase or extract through force. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a folded document. He held it out to me, holding it between his thumb and index finger like a weapon. He explained that the document was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement drafted by his family's legal team. The stipulations were draconian. The contract demanded that I retract the evidence I sent to the country club matriarchs. It required me to issue a formal public statement claiming the liquidation of the $3 million trust was a misunderstood family investment strategy that I had previously authorized. Preston was demanding that I publicly perjure myself to cover up my parents' felony grand larceny, so he could marry my sister without the stain of a financial scandal attached to his political record. I looked at the document, and then looked up at his face. I did not reach out to take the paper. I felt the familiar clinical detachment settle over me. I was not dealing with a family member, I was dealing with a hostile corporate entity attempting an illegal merger. I asked him what would happen if I declined his generous offer. Preston smiled, a tight, humorless expression that did not reach his eyes. He dropped the pretense of negotiation and shifted directly into extortion. He detailed his family's extensive connections within the Texas state licensing boards. He claimed he had the leverage to initiate a bad faith ethics investigation against me. He threatened to drag my name through a prolonged administrative review, explicitly stating he could have my corporate auditing license revoked before the end of the fiscal quarter. He was threatening to destroy my entire professional livelihood, the career I had built from the ground up through grueling graveyard shifts and relentless data analysis. He wanted to starve me out, believing the threat of professional ruin would bring me to my knees. As he outlined his extortion plot, detailing exactly how he would leverage his political influence to destroy my license, I slowly slid my right hand into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against the smooth metal edge of my smartphone. Without breaking eye contact, I navigated the tactile buttons on the side of the device, activating the voice recording application. I needed him to verify his knowledge of the crime. I kept my voice perfectly flat, encouraging him to speak. I asked him to clarify his demands. I asked him if he was fully aware that the $3 million extracted from the trust was achieved through a forged signature. Preston laughed, a dismissive, arrogant sound. He stated that the legality of the withdrawal was irrelevant. He claimed that in the real world, power dictates the truth, and right now he held all the power. He confirmed his knowledge of the stolen funds, explicitly stating that the origin of the capital did not matter as long as the public narrative remained pristine. He had just confessed to conspiracy and attempted extortion on a public sidewalk. He finished his monologue tapping the non-disclosure agreement against the palm of his hand, demanding my signature. I slowly withdrew my hand from my blazer pocket, bringing my smartphone into his line of sight. I tapped the screen, stopping the recording, and saving the high-definition audio file to my encrypted cloud server. Preston stopped tapping the document. His eyes locked onto the glowing screen of my device. The arrogant smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He asked what I was doing. I looked at him with the cold precision of an auditor presenting a final damning ledger. I informed Preston of a specific legal statute. I explained that the state of Texas operates under a one-party consent law regarding the recording of conversations. I detailed that as long as one active participant in the dialogue consents, the audio recording is entirely legal, admissible in a court of law, and admissible to the general public. The color drained from his face. The bespoke suit suddenly looked entirely too large for his frame. He realized the gravity of his miscalculation. He had not just threatened an estranged sister, he had delivered a recorded confession of political extortion to a forensic auditor. I stepped closer, forcing him to take a defensive step backward toward his SUV. I delivered the final terms of our interaction. I told him that I was keeping the audio file securely stored. I promised him that if he ever approached me again, if he ever attempted to contact my firm, or if he proceeded with his threat to manipulate the state licensing board, that recording would not go to the police. I told him it would go directly to the campaign managers of his political opponents and the editorial board of the Houston Chronicle. Preston stood frozen on the concrete. The realization that I possessed the power to detonate his entire political future paralyzed him. He had brought a non-disclosure agreement to a gunfight, and I had just disarmed him completely. I turned my back on the prospective state senator and continued my walk down the sidewalk toward my high-rise apartment. I did not look back to see him scramble into his luxury vehicle. The extortion attempt was neutralized, but the fallout from Preston's realization was about to hit my family with the force of a freight train. The golden child was about to lose her crown, and the entire illusion was preparing to collapse. Preston's retreat was not a strategic withdrawal, it was a panicked sprint for survival. He drove his luxury SUV away from my corporate office, leaving tire marks on the pavement. The recorded confession of his extortion attempt fundamentally altered his calculus. He realized the Ward family was not just a social liability, they were a legal hazard that could incinerate his political future. Within 24 hours of our confrontation, Preston executed a ruthless public severance. He did not issue a gentle press release citing irreconcilable differences. He acted with the swift brutality of a politician cutting ties with a scandal. He instructed his family's lawyers to formally cancel the venue reservations, withdrawing his name from all vendor contracts. He packed his belongings from the luxury apartment he shared with Victoria and vanished, terminating the engagement with a single certified letter. The high society wedding, the event my parents had stolen $3 million to finance, evaporated overnight. Victoria was left standing in the ruins of her manufactured kingdom. To comprehend the severity of her collapse, you must understand the architecture of her identity. Victoria had never experienced a consequence. When she failed a college course, Richard paid for a private tutor to essentially take the exams for her. When she crashed her first car, Sylvia blamed the manufacturer and bought her a newer model. Victoria's entire existence was a curated performance designed to secure a wealthy provider. Preston was supposed to be the ultimate return on that investment. Without a fiancé to fund her aesthetic, and without a stolen trust fund to subsidize her vanity, Victoria's reality fractured. The elite bridal boutique in Dallas, where Sylvia had snapped that fateful champagne photo, refused to refund the $20,000 deposit. The custom silk gowns hanging in her closet were transformed from symbols of prestige into suffocating reminders of her failure. For the first time in her 26 years, Victoria faced a problem that her mother could not solve with a checkbook. The golden child illusion shattered, exposing a fragile, incompetent adult devoid of basic survival skills. She spiraled into a profound meltdown, characterized by manic phone calls and desperate social media posts begging Preston to reconsider. But the political machine had already erased her. Her former social circle, comprised entirely of women waiting to marry into Preston's network, ghosted her. The cancellation of the wedding was the catalyst that accelerated my parents' financial freefall. Richard had structured his speculative real estate debts around the assumption that Victoria's marriage into a prominent political family would open doors to new investors. He believed Preston's father would bail him out of his underwater commercial lots once the ink on the marriage license dried. That lifeline was permanently severed. The creditors who had been patiently waiting for the wedding to conclude began circling the suburban mansion. Without the steady influx of stolen capital, Richard defaulted on 3 consecutive mortgage payments. The bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings, planting a stark white notice directly on the manicured lawn of their estate. Sylvia's descent was equally precipitous. The country club board reviewed their delinquent accounts and revoked their membership, terminating her access to the only stage where she held any influence. The women she had tried to weaponize against me during her digital smear campaign now treated her like a pariah. The isolation she had designed for me became her own inescapable reality. The parasitic host had been systematically starved. The stolen inheritance was gone. The political merger had failed, and the social standing was incinerated. They were trapped in a sprawling house they could not afford, surrounded by expensive furniture they could no longer maintain. I observed the collapse from my Houston penthouse, receiving periodic updates through the quiet efficiency of public financial records. I monitored the foreclosure filings and the civil suits filed by the unpaid wedding vendors. I felt a cold, clinical satisfaction. The ledger was balancing itself exactly as I had predicted. The universe is a strict auditor demanding payment for every unearned privilege. But I knew the psychology of the people who raised me. Desperation operates like a cornered animal. When a parasite realizes it is facing imminent starvation, it does not reflect on its mistakes or seek legitimate employment. It attacks. Richard and Sylvia had exhausted their social capital and failed in their attempts to manipulate me through my professional network. They were out of options and out of time. The impending loss of their physical home stripped away the final veneer of their dignity. They realized the digital blocks were impenetrable and the extortion tactics were useless. They needed a direct confrontation. They needed to bypass the electronic firewalls and breach the physical perimeter of my new life. I sat at my desk reviewing a forensic analysis for a corporate client, checking the timestamp on the digital file. It was a Thursday afternoon. I anticipated their next move, understanding that the threshold of their panic was about to force a physical escalation. They were preparing to abandon the suburbs of Dallas and drive south. They were coming to Houston. They believed that if they stood in front of me, if they weaponized the physical bond of family, they could force me to capitulate. They assumed the ghost of the people-pleasing daughter still lingered somewhere beneath my corporate armor. They were about to learn that the girl they starved for affection had built a fortress of glass and steel, and she was holding the keys to their final destruction. The distance between Dallas and Houston is a long stretch of desolate Texas highway. For Richard and Sylvia, that transit must have felt like a funeral march. They were out of leverage and stripped of their social armor. The banks had frozen their credit lines. The foreclosure notice was hammered into their front lawn, serving as a public monument to their failure. Desperation strips a human being of their conditioned etiquette. When the threat of homelessness becomes acute, people abandon dignity. They forget the rules of engagement. They stop caring about country club protocol and revert to raw survival instincts. They drove south with a single objective. They needed a host. It was a Thursday morning. I was reviewing a quarterly risk assessment for a corporate client when the red indicator light on my desk console illuminated. The direct line to the lobby security desk rarely rang. I picked up the receiver and listened to the head of building operations. He maintained a level professional cadence, but I could hear a distinct chaotic disruption in the background. He informed me that 2 unauthorized individuals had breached the primary visitor checkpoint. They were currently standing in the sunlit, glass-walled reception area, causing a severe scene. The security chief explained that the older man was raising his voice at the front desk, attendants claiming to be my father and demanding immediate access to the executive floors. A woman was standing next to him, weeping loudly. The chief asked for authorization to dispatch the local police and have them removed for trespassing. A standard response would be an immediate eviction from the premises. Sending them out in handcuffs would have provided a quick resolution, but having them arrested in the lobby allows them to retain a sliver of victimhood. If they were dragged out by law enforcement, they would spin the narrative for years. They would tell anyone who would listen that their estranged daughter had them jailed just for trying to reconcile during a difficult season. I decided to strip away that final narrative. I wanted them to step out of their suburban delusion and walk directly into the architecture of my reality. I instructed the security chief to print 2 temporary visitor badges. I told him to escort them to the private elevator and send them up to the main executive boardroom on the 42nd floor. I left my office and walked down the quiet, carpeted corridor. The boardroom was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. It featured a polished mahogany table designed to seat 30 executives. The perimeter was lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering an unobstructed view of the Houston financial district. The air conditioning hummed with a quiet, pristine precision. I took my seat at the head of the long table, folding my hands on the smooth wood. I waited for the elevator chime. The heavy steel doors parted with a soft mechanical sigh. Richard and Sylvia stepped onto the executive floor. The visual contrast was startling. For my entire life, I had only seen them draped in curated perfection. Now they looked like refugees fleeing a financial disaster zone. Richard's tailored suit was deeply wrinkled across the shoulders. The knot of his silk tie was pulled loose and his collar was unbuttoned. He had not shaved in days. Sylvia looked worse. She wore a simple trench coat, her posture hunched. The expensive cosmetics she usually wore to mask her age were absent, revealing deep lines of panic and chronic sleep deprivation. They walked through the glass doors of the boardroom. The sheer scale of the environment hit them like a physical force. They saw the panoramic view of the city, the expensive art hanging on the structural pillars, and the sleek efficiency of the analysts working in the outer offices. This was the empire of the daughter they had starved for resources. This was the fortress built by the child they deemed lacking in ambition. They stopped at the opposite end of the mahogany table. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not gesture for them to sit in the plush leather chairs. I let them stand. Richard placed his hands on the back of a chair, trying to anchor himself. He cleared his throat, attempting to summon the old authoritative tone he used to discipline me in my youth. His voice lacked resonance, echoing thinly against the soundproof glass walls. He did not start with an apology. A true narcissist never acknowledges the original sin because doing so would require accountability. Instead, he launched into a calculated business pitch. He stated that the family was enduring an acute liquidity crisis. He claimed the real estate market had shifted unfairly against him, and the banks were acting with unwarranted hostility. Then he addressed the $3 million. He did not call it theft. He did not use the word forgery. He framed the liquidation of my grandfather's trust as an aggressive borrowing strategy. He called it a temporary reallocation of family assets that simply encountered unforeseen market friction. The mental gymnastics required to rebrand felony grand larceny as a strategic investment error were breathtaking. He spoke as if forging a signature was just a minor clerical oversight. His delusion peaked as he laid out his proposed solution. Richard informed me that he had researched my auditing firm. He knew about my rapid promotions. He estimated the value of my corporate stock options and my annual performance bonuses. He demanded that I liquidate my equity portfolio immediately. He instructed me to wire the funds to his primary checking account to halt the foreclosure on the suburban mansion and settle the outstanding debts from Victoria's canceled wedding. He expected blood loyalty to override all logic. He stood in my corporate headquarters and essentially argued that because he was my father, I owed him the capital required to cover up his own crimes. He believed the biological tie gave him an unconditional claim to my intellect, my labor, and my future. He finished his pitch by stating that family protects family, and it was my turn to step up and ensure the Ward legacy remained intact. Sylvia nodded along, wiping her eyes, expecting me to cave under the pressure of their physical presence. They thought their arrival would break my clinical detachment. They assumed that seeing them broken and desperate would activate the ghost of the people-pleasing daughter. I looked at Richard. I looked at Sylvia. I felt the familiar weight of the leather folio resting on the table directly beneath my folded hands. They believed they were negotiating a bailout. They had no idea they were attending their own financial execution. I was about to slide the paperwork across the mahogany wood and introduce them to the final architect of their ruin. Richard finished his pitch, and the sound of his voice faded into the soundproof glass walls of the executive boardroom. He stood at the opposite end of the mahogany table, breathing heavily, his hands gripping the leather back of an empty chair. He wore an expression of expectant entitlement. He truly believed his performance had bridged the chasm between us. He thought invoking the concept of family loyalty would act as a universal solvent, dissolving the reality of his crimes, and forcing me to open my corporate equity portfolio to save his suburban estate. I let the silence stretch. In a high-stakes negotiation, the person who speaks first to fill a quiet void always concedes power. I watched him shift his weight uncomfortably. Sylvia stared at me with wide, desperate eyes, waiting for me to pull out a checkbook and surrender my future to erase their mistakes. I unclasped my hands and leaned forward, resting my forearms against the polished wood. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the measured cadence of an auditor presenting a final terminal ledger to a corrupt board of directors. I informed Richard that he was operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. I told him he was standing in my headquarters asking for a financial rescue from a crisis that did not actually exist in the way he comprehended it. I explained that the foreclosure on his house and the collapse of his commercial lots were merely symptoms of a much deeper terminal illness. He frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to decipher my meaning. He opened his mouth to reiterate his demand for my stock options. I raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. I reached to my right and pulled a sleek black leather folio toward the center of the table. It was a deliberate visual echo of the Warren Estate portfolio I had uncovered in his home office 14 months prior. I unclasped the binding and opened the cover. I extracted a stack of crisp legal documents bound by a heavy metal clip. I did not toss the papers. I placed my fingertips on the top sheet and slid the stack across the smooth mahogany surface. The documents glided silently, coming to a stop directly in front of his hands. Richard looked down at the header. He recognized the emblem of the West Texas estate law firm immediately. I told him that forensic accounting is not just about identifying missing capital, it is about analyzing the structural architecture surrounding the missing funds. When I discovered the forged release authorization and the drained accounts on the day of my graduation, I did not just secure the photographic evidence and drive away. I used my professional credentials to initiate a deep background audit on the entire scope of my grandfather's estate. To understand the documents resting under Richard's hands, you must understand how old Texas oil money is structured. Grandpa William did not accumulate his wealth through simple savings accounts. He built his fortune on complex commercial oil leases, mineral rights, and heavy machinery depreciations. In the energy sector, wealth is often tied to deferred corporate tax liabilities. Companies utilize tax shelters and delayed reporting mechanisms to maximize their liquid capital while pushing the tax burden down the road. Grandpa William was a brilliant strategist who understood both the energy markets and the fatal flaws of his own son. He knew Richard was a predator cloaked in a country club blazer. He anticipated that Richard would eventually discover the blind trust. He knew my father lacked the discipline to wait for the natural vesting date. He predicted that Richard would forge the necessary signatures to breach the account and extract the $3 million to fund his vanity projects. So Grandpa William engineered a defense mechanism. In corporate finance, it is known as a poison pill. It is a tactic designed to make a hostile takeover so financially ruinous that it destroys the acquiring entity. I watched Richard flip to the second page of the document. His eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs. I narrated the mechanics of the trap for him, ensuring he understood every nuance of his own destruction. I explained that the $3 million he stole was not isolated capital. It was intentionally parked directly on top of a cluster of toxic deferred corporate tax liabilities tied to my grandfather's most lucrative oil leases. The trust was structured with a highly specific tripwire. If the account remained untouched and vested naturally, on the day of my university graduation, a separate escrow fund within the estate would automatically clear those tax liabilities. The money would transition to me cleanly. But Grandpa William included an irrevocable subclause. If the trust was breached, liquidated early, or accessed via an unauthorized release authorization, the protective escrow shield immediately dissolved. The protective barriers evaporated. The consequences of that dissolution were unforgiving. The legal burden of those deferred taxes automatically and permanently transferred to the individual whose signature appeared on the release authorization document. Richard stopped reading. His eyes locked onto a specific paragraph near the bottom of the page. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His jaw slackened. He had assumed the blind trust was just a pile of unattended cash waiting to be harvested. He was so eager to secure the funds for Victoria's silk gowns and his own failing real estate ventures that he did not hire an independent attorney to review the subclauses. His arrogance blinded him to the basic principles of risk assessment. He believed he was outsmarting an old oil man. He had no idea he was stepping into a bear trap that had been waiting for him for 5 years. I watched the realization wash over him. I detailed the final arithmetic of his greed. I told him that by forging my signature and transferring the funds to his personal accounts, he did not just steal $3 million. He activated the tripwire. He triggered a delayed reporting mechanism that transferred a staggering federal tax debt directly onto his own financial profile. Sylvia leaned over his arm, trying to read the paperwork. She could not comprehend the complex tax jargon, but she understood the terror radiating from her husband. She asked him what the document meant. Her voice was thin and trembling. Richard could not answer her. His vocal cords seemed paralyzed. I answered for him, keeping my tone perfectly level. I told Sylvia that her husband had legally assumed an $8 million federal tax debt. The number echoed against the glass walls of the boardroom. $8 million. It was a sum that dwarfed the initial theft. It was a liability that could not be discharged in a standard bankruptcy proceeding. It was a financial anchor heavy enough to drag their entire lineage down to the bottom of the ocean. Grandpa William had sacrificed the $3 million as bait. He knew the capital would be lost, but he considered it a necessary operational expense to ensure the permanent eradication of the parasite infecting his bloodline. He weaponized their own insatiable greed against them, turning their theft into an act of financial suicide. Richard slowly raised his head. He looked at me with an expression of hollow devastation. The facade of the authoritative patriarch was entirely incinerated. He was a ruined man sitting in the ashes of his own arrogance. He tried to formulate a defense, attempting to process the magnitude of the trap he had triggered. He stammered, hoping there was a loophole, a legal maneuver, or a technicality he could exploit to reverse the transfer. I shattered that final illusion. I leaned back in my chair and informed him that the trap was already sprung. The mechanics of the poison pill did not just transfer the debt, it generated an automatic notification to the highest financial authority in the country. The grace period had expired while they were busy trying to save their country club memberships. The federal government was already moving, and the consequences were preparing to breach their front door. Richard continued to stare at the dense legal paragraphs, his eyes scanning the words without seemingly absorbing their meaning. The concept of an $8 million federal tax liability was too vast for a man who had spent his life managing petty social climbing and mid-level real estate flips. Sylvia, however, understood the physical reality of the threat. She grasped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning white to keep her knees from buckling. The polished veneer of the country club matriarch evaporated, leaving behind a terrified woman who suddenly realized she was standing on a trapdoor. I did not let the silence stretch long enough for them to formulate a lie. I needed to meticulously explain the cold arithmetic of their ruin, ensuring they understood that there was no exit strategy. I picked up a secondary document from the leather folio and placed it beside the trust parameters. This sheet bore a different seal, one that commands absolute unyielding terror in the American financial system. It was the official insignia of the Internal Revenue Service. I informed Richard that the documents resting in front of him were not just estate planning hypotheticals. They were active notices of a federal tax lien. To understand the severity of an IRS lien, you must understand the hierarchy of American debt. When you owe a credit card company or a private vendor, they have to sue you, secure a judgment, and navigate a maze of civil litigation to collect their funds. They are constrained by procedural red tape. The federal government operates under entirely different rules. The IRS does not need a court order to seize your life. They possess unilateral administrative authority to freeze your banking accounts, garnish your wages, and place permanent claims on your physical property. They are the apex predator of the financial ecosystem. I detailed the exact sequence of events his forgery had initiated. When Richard signed my name on that release authorization, the trust executing software automatically generated a K-1 tax schedule. That schedule was electronically filed with the federal government, reporting the $3 million liquidation and simultaneously assigning the associated $8 million deferred corporate tax liability to the signer. Richard assumed the withdrawal was a private family matter invisible to the outside world. He failed to realize that the modern banking infrastructure is a heavily surveilled grid. I pointed to the second paragraph of the federal notice. I explained that the IRS had already recognized the discrepancy. They saw a $3 million influx of capital entering Richard's accounts. They saw that capital being diverted into non-deductible luxury expenses. They tracked the wire transfers to Dallas bridal boutiques, high-end event planners, and commercial holding companies. Because Richard did not report the $3 million as taxable income on his annual filings, he had not just assumed the inherited tax debt. He had committed active tax evasion on the stolen principal. I watched the realization register in his eyes. He was no longer dealing with an estranged daughter, who could be intimidated into silence. He was dealing with a federal bureaucracy that viewed him as a delinquent asset ready for liquidation. I laid out the consequences, outlining the timeline of their impending destruction. I told them the IRS had already initiated a full forensic audit of Richard's entire financial portfolio. The federal agents were currently dissecting his speculative real estate holding company, mapping out the intricate web of his leveraged debts. I informed them that because the stolen funds were utilized for personal luxury expenses, rather than legitimate business operations, the government possessed the authority to execute immediate asset forfeiture. The suburban mansion they were desperately trying to save from the private bank foreclosure was now subject to federal seizure. Their remaining retirement accounts, the funds they had intended to rely on in their old age, would be frozen and drained by the end of the fiscal quarter. Victoria's fleet of leased luxury vehicles would be impounded. Everything they owned, every physical manifestation of their curated high society identity, was scheduled for liquidation to satisfy the debt. Grandpa William had engineered a masterpiece of punitive justice. He recognized that suing Richard in civil court for the stolen $3 million would result in a messy, prolonged family battle. Richard would have obfuscated, delayed, and played the victim. So Grandpa William removed the family element entirely. He weaponized their own greed, transferring the jurisdiction of their punishment directly to the federal government. He sacrificed his capital to ensure that when they finally showed their true colors, a force much larger and far more ruthless than I could ever be would permanently dismantle them. Sylvia began to tremble. Her breathing grew shallow and erratic. She looked at Richard, expecting him to formulate a plan to call a lawyer or leverage a political connection. But Richard was a hollow shell. He had always relied on the illusion of his competence to navigate crises. Now facing a verified $8 million federal lien, the illusion was incinerated. He looked across the mahogany table, his voice cracking as he finally spoke. He asked me how I obtained the federal notices. He wanted to know how an independent auditor in Houston possessed classified IRS communications regarding his personal tax liabilities. He was clinging to a desperate hope that the documents were forged, that this was an elaborate bluff designed to force him into submission. I shattered that final hope with the clinical precision of a surgeon. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and delivered the killing blow. I informed him that as a licensed forensic accountant operating within the state of Texas, I am legally bound by a strict code of professional ethics. I am a mandatory reporter of financial fraud. When I discovered the forged release authorization and the drained trust accounts 14 months ago, I did not just build a digital archive for my own protection. I fulfilled my fiduciary duty. I compiled the evidence, the photographs of the forged signature, the corrupted notary stamp, the itemized wire transfers, and the original trust parameters. I did not send that dossier to the local police. I sent it directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I filed a formal whistleblower report explicitly detailing the theft to clear my own name from the $8 million tax liability. I had to prove to the federal government that I did not authorize the withdrawal to protect my own corporate auditing license and my pristine financial standing. Richard stared at me, the final pieces of the architecture snapping into place. I had not just observed his crime, I had handed the prosecution the exact blueprint needed to secure his conviction. I had served my own father to the federal wolves to ensure the survival of my own empire. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The air conditioning hummed steadily. The traffic moved silently on the streets 42 floors below. The power dynamic had permanently shifted. The patriarch who had dismissed my ambition and the mother who had weaponized my existence were now entirely at my mercy. But I had no mercy left to give. The ledger was balanced, and the federal auditors were officially at their door. Sylvia broke the quiet of the executive floor. The sound she produced was not a dignified cry of sorrow. It was a raw, unfiltered noise of structural collapse. The polite veneer she had spent her adult life polishing shattered right there on the mahogany table. Tears carved distinct tracks through her thick foundation, ruining the carefully applied cosmetics she wore to mask her age. She wept with a messy, selfish grief, mourning the death of her social standing and the impending loss of her curated comfort. She did not shed a single tear for the daughter she had betrayed or the trust she had violated. She was only crying because the invoice for her vanity had finally arrived. She reached across the wide expanse of the polished wood. Her manicured fingers grasped at the empty air, attempting to bridge the physical and psychological distance between us. She pleaded with me, her voice cracking under the strain of her panic. She demanded that I use my corporate connections to fix the deficit. She instructed me to hire the most ruthless tax attorneys in Houston and deploy my firm's resources to negotiate a settlement with the federal government. She leaned heavily into the concept of genetics, claiming that we shared the same blood and that biology mandated my immediate intervention. She spun a frantic, desperate narrative, suggesting we could fight the audit together as a unified front protecting the family name. I watched her unravel. I felt no elevated heart rate. I experienced zero physiological stress. I observed her panic through the lens of a clinical assessor watching a failing entity attempt a hostile reorganization. The audacity of her request was a marvel of narcissistic mathematics. They had gutted my future to fund a silk gown and a failed political merger. Now facing the direct consequences of their grand larceny, they expected me to step into the crosshairs of the federal government to shield them from a prison sentence. I did not reach out to take her hand. I let her fingers hover over the wood until the awkward discomfort forced her to withdraw. I shifted my gaze away from my weeping mother and locked eyes with my father. Richard was still staring at the tax lien notices, his breathing shallow and rapid. I decided it was time to close the ledger using his own specific methodology. I kept my vocal register low and even. I told Richard I wanted to revisit a brief conversation we had 14 months ago. I painted the scene for him, ensuring he remembered the exact context. I reminded him of the sweltering heat of the Austin graduation auditorium. I reminded him of the empty folding chairs in the fourth row. I reminded him of the phone call I made to him while he was standing in a Dallas bridal boutique holding a crystal flute watching Victoria model imported fabric. I recited his exact words, delivering them with the precise callous cadence he had used that afternoon. "We only invest in the child who will make us proud." The sentence hung in the chilled air of the boardroom. I let the echoes settle against the soundproof glass walls. I pointed out the staggering hypocrisy of his current position. I told him he had made his investment. He allocated every ounce of his stolen capital into Victoria. He bet his entire future on her manufactured aesthetic and her failed political engagement. He treated me as an underperforming asset unworthy of his attention, his presence, or his funding. I folded my hands back together on the desk. I informed him that his chosen investment had yielded a catastrophic return. The market had corrected, and his portfolio was entirely bankrupt. I asked him why he was sitting in my headquarters, begging for a bailout from the exact child he deemed a worthless venture. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He had no defense against his own quoted arrogance. The mirror I held up to his face reflected a pathetic, ruined man who had gambled his freedom on a golden child, incapable of generating a single dollar of actual value. Sylvia tried to interrupt, attempting to override the cold logic with more loud weeping. She begged me to look past the graduation incident, claiming it was just a temporary lapse in judgment. She reiterated that I possessed the legal expertise to unravel the tax lien and save the suburban mansion from federal forfeiture. She insisted that my corporate firm could bury the paperwork, hide the routing numbers, and make the investigators look the other way. I needed to extinguish that specific delusion immediately. I needed them to understand the fundamental difference between their world of country club favors and my world of corporate compliance. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. I explained the rigid architecture of my profession. I am a licensed forensic accountant operating under the strict jurisdiction of state and federal regulatory boards. My career is built on the uncompromising exposure of financial deceit. I do not bury fraud, I excavate it. I told them I possessed a non-negotiable fiduciary duty to report illicit financial activity, especially when that activity directly implicates my own legal identity. When the trust execution software generated that tax schedule and assigned the $8 million deferred liability to my name, it created an existential threat to my auditing license. The federal government assumed I was the beneficiary of those liquidated funds. They assumed I was the one harboring the untaxed capital in offshore accounts. I could not simply ignore the discrepancy. Remaining silent would have made me an active accessory to their tax evasion. It would have resulted in the revocation of my professional credentials, the destruction of my livelihood, and my own potential prosecution. I looked at Sylvia, her tear-streaked face frozen in sudden apprehension. I told her I did not just stumble upon their crime and walk away to start a new life. I took proactive, definitive action to insulate my empire from their corruption. I detailed the exact contents of the dossier I had prepared. I listed the high-resolution photographs of the forged release authorization. I mentioned the visual proof of her counterfeit signature and the corrupted stamp from the local real estate broker who played in Richard's weekly golf foursome. I cataloged the itemized wire transfers proving the capital flowed directly into their personal holding accounts and Victoria's luxury vendors. I informed them that I did not hire corporate lawyers to fight the Internal Revenue Service on their behalf. I acted as the primary witness for the prosecution. I had packaged that entire dossier into a certified whistleblower report. I forwarded the comprehensive file directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the federal government. I handed the federal agents the exact blueprint they needed to track the stolen capital, secure the warrants, and initiate the asset forfeiture protocols. I cleared my own name from the crushing tax liability by mathematically proving they were the sole architects of the grand larceny. I explained that the blast radius of this investigation would spare no one. The real estate broker who notarized the fraudulent document was already under investigation for accessory to wire fraud. The vendors who accepted the stolen funds were facing clawback lawsuits. The federal net was pulled tight, and my parents were trapped right in the center. Richard let out a hollow, ragged breath. The final pillar of his reality collapsed. He realized I had not merely trapped them, I had initiated the legal strike that would end their freedom. I looked at the two people who had brought me into the world. They were stripped of their leverage, their stolen wealth, and their unearned pride. I delivered the concluding statement of our interaction. I told them the Bank of Madeline was permanently closed. There would be no bailouts, no legal rescue, and no further communication. The federal auditors were officially at their door, and they would have to face the music entirely alone. The boardroom descended into a profound, deafening silence. The negotiation was over, the verdict was delivered, but the physical reality of their removal still needed to be executed. I prepared to initiate the final protocol to purge them from my environment, knowing that forcing them back out into the bright Houston sun would be the most humiliating walk of their lives. I reached across the expanse of the mahogany desk and pressed the silver intercom button. The connection to the security desk engaged with a soft electronic tone. I spoke clearly into the microphone, instructing the chief of operations to send his team up to the 42nd floor. I ordered the immediate removal of the two unauthorized individuals currently occupying my executive boardroom. Richard did not flinch. He remained locked in a state of cognitive paralysis, staring at the federal tax liens resting under his hands. The reality of an $8 million liability had short-circuited his ability to process information. Sylvia, however, recognized the finality of the eviction. She understood that weeping would not reverse the mechanics of a federal audit. She grabbed Richard's arm, digging her manicured fingers into the fabric of his ruined suit, physically hauling him upward. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom slid open. 3 security officers dressed in sharp corporate uniforms stepped into the room. They flanked my parents, directing them toward the exit. I remained seated, watching the procession move through the corridor. My staff, junior analysts, and senior partners alike watched the scene unfold. They witnessed the architect of my childhood abuse being stripped of his unearned pride and escorted off the premises like a common trespasser. They were funneled into the private elevator, descending 42 stories back to the street level. I imagined their long, silent drive north toward Dallas. They were returning to a sprawling suburban estate that was no longer legally theirs, existing in a temporary limbo before the federal hammer dropped. The machinery of the United States government operates with a slow, ruthless efficiency. When the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service validates a whistleblower report involving millions of dollars in stolen capital and tax evasion, they do not send polite warning letters. They execute a coordinated administrative strike designed to lock down the assets before the target can liquidate them and flee the jurisdiction. Exactly 6 days after Richard and Sylvia were escorted out of my Houston headquarters, the federal net closed. It happened on a Wednesday morning. Richard attempted to purchase a tank of premium gasoline using his corporate credit card. The transaction was declined. He called his primary banking institution, assuming it was a simple fraud alert. The customer service representative informed him that all of his accounts, personal and commercial, were officially frozen under a federal warrant. The execution of the asset forfeiture protocols was systematic and uncompromising. Federal agents arrived at the suburban mansion carrying sealed orders signed by a federal judge. They did not care about the custom framing on the family portraits or the imported Italian marble in the foyer. They viewed the property merely as collateral to be seized and auctioned to satisfy a fraction of the $8 million tax debt. Richard and Sylvia were given 48 hours to vacate the premises. They were permitted to take only personal clothing and essential items. The expensive furniture, the curated art collection, and the luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway were impounded as federal property. The eviction was a public spectacle, destroying the final remnants of their manufactured social standing. The neighbors, the very people Sylvia had spent decades trying to impress, watched from behind drawn curtains as government contractors changed the locks on the heavy front doors. The illusion of the affluent Dallas dynasty was permanently incinerated right there on the manicured lawn. Stripped of their capital and their credit, my parents faced a grim reality. You cannot maintain a country club aesthetic when your bank balance is negative and your social security number is flagged for felony tax evasion. The exclusive neighborhoods were closed to them. The high-end rental properties required background checks they could no longer pass. They were forced to relocate to the industrial outskirts of the city. Through the quiet efficiency of public records, I tracked their descent. They secured a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a decaying complex, squeezed between a commercial trucking route and a manufacturing plant. The transition from a sweeping suburban estate to a low-income rental with paper-thin walls and unreliable plumbing was a brutal mathematical correction. The universe balances its ledger, forcing individuals to pay the invoices they tried to ignore. Richard, a man who spent his life wearing bespoke suits and mocking the concept of manual labor, was suddenly confronted by the harsh mechanics of survival. Without his speculative real estate holding company and barred from securing any corporate employment due to the pending federal indictment, he had to find immediate liquid cash just to keep the electricity running in their apartment. He secured a position at a regional logistics warehouse located 10 miles from their complex. The man who once scoffed at my graveyard shifts, who told me that forensic accounting lacked ambition, was now clocking in at 3 in the morning to load heavy freight pallets onto delivery trucks. He was earning a minimum wage, answering to shift managers 3 decades his junior. The physical toll of the labor, coupled with the psychological devastation of his ruined ego, aged him exponentially. Sylvia was equally trapped in the wreckage. Her entire identity was tied to her ability to consume luxury goods and wield social influence. In the cramped apartment, she had no audience. The women she used to invite to catered luncheons ignored her frantic phone calls. She spent her days sitting in the dim living room, listening to the roar of the semi-trucks passing on the highway, entirely isolated from the world she had sacrificed my inheritance to inhabit. They were living in a prison constructed from their own greed. The federal auditors were methodically dismantling the remains of Richard's business, tracking every stolen dollar, tracing the wire transfers back to the source. The threat of federal indictment hung over their heads, a permanent shadow they could not escape. But a parasitic ecosystem rarely collapses without inflicting collateral damage on its primary beneficiary. While Richard and Sylvia suffered the consequences of their theft, the golden child was left standing alone in the crossfire. Victoria had spent her entire 26 years being shielded from consequence, subsidized by the very fraud that had just detonated. With her parents facing absolute financial ruin and the federal government seizing the assets that funded her luxury lifestyle, Victoria was suddenly exposed. The protective bubble burst, leaving her vulnerable to the harsh, unforgiving reality of a world that demands actual competence. She had lost her wealthy fiancé, her unearned prestige, and her endless supply of capital. Now she was about to discover exactly what happens when a parasite is forced to survive without a host. The golden child was preparing to face her own unique brand of karma, and the fallout was destined to be spectacular. A parasitic ecosystem relies on a very specific hierarchy to function. The host absorbs the damage and generates the resources, while the beneficiary extracts the nutrients without providing any reciprocal value. For 26 years, Victoria existed at the very top of that food chain. She lived inside a curated terrarium, shielded from the harsh climate of consequence. My parents served as the buffer, absorbing her failures and financing her aesthetic. They shielded her from the cold reality of the American economic system. When the Internal Revenue Service seized my parents' assets and exiled them to an industrial apartment, that protective buffer disintegrated. The climate control shut off, and Victoria was thrust into the freezing temperature of the real world. The illusion of her immunity was the first casualty. Victoria believed that because she did not personally forge my signature on the trust documents, she was insulated from the federal fallout. She assumed she could simply distance herself from our parents and maintain her elevated lifestyle. She failed to comprehend the concept of asset tracing. Federal auditors do not stop at the primary offender. They follow the money. They track the wire transfers through the banking grid, identifying every entity that absorbed the stolen capital. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning in Dallas. Victoria walked out of her upscale apartment complex expecting to run errands. She approached the curb where she parked her luxury sport utility vehicle. The vehicle was a premier European model secured by Richard using a heavy down payment generated from my liquidated trust fund. She found a flatbed tow truck idling next to her car. Two federal agents wearing dark jackets were supervising the hookup process. Victoria attempted to intervene. She leveraged the only tactic she knew, relying on her curated aesthetic and her practiced indignation. She demanded that they release her property. She threatened to call her lawyers. She acted as if she were confronting a rude valet attendant at a country club. You cannot intimidate a federal agent executing a civil forfeiture warrant. The agents did not argue with her. They did not care about her canceled political engagement or her designer coat. They handed her a single sheet of paper documenting the seizure of property purchased with illicit funds. She stood on the concrete sidewalk watching the hydraulic lift elevate her unearned prestige onto the bed of the truck. She watched her mobility and her status get towed down the street, disappearing into the morning traffic. The seizure of the vehicle was the catalyst that accelerated her collapse. Without a car, she lost her primary mode of transportation. Without Preston, she lost her access to the Dallas elite. Her bank accounts held zero cash reserves because she had always treated our father as a bottomless, automated teller machine. The vendors from her canceled wedding were still pursuing civil judgments against her for breach of contract. She faced imminent eviction from her apartment because she lacked the funds to cover the upcoming rent cycle. The friends who used to attend her lavish dinners ghosted her. They recognized the toxic scent of financial ruin and severed their ties. Desperation forces a narcissist to abandon their pride. Victoria realized she had exhausted her local options. She recognized that there was only one person left in her orbit who possessed actual verified wealth. She needed a new host. I sat in my Houston office finalizing a risk assessment matrix for a corporate client. My personal smartphone rested on my desk, the screen illuminated, displaying an incoming call from an unregistered local number. I let it ring. The caller hung up and immediately dialed again. The pattern repeated 4 times, indicating a frantic urgency. I allowed the calls to route to my visual voicemail dashboard. The audio files populated on my screen. Victoria had purchased a prepaid mobile device to bypass the digital blocks I had established. I tapped the screen and listened to the recordings. The audio was a masterclass in unfiltered entitlement. Victoria did not begin with an apology. She did not acknowledge the smear campaign she had participated in, or the theft that had funded her lifestyle. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, conveying authentic panic. She informed me that her lease was terminating at the end of the week. She stated that our parents' new apartment was a filthy industrial nightmare and she refused to sleep on a futon. She issued a demand. She told me I needed to wire her emergency funds for a new security deposit. She insisted that I owed her a guest bedroom in my Houston penthouse until she could get back on her feet. She framed her request as a biological obligation, claiming that sisters protect each other during a crisis. She expected me to rescue her simply because we shared the same genetic code. I sat in the quiet air conditioning of my office, analyzing her vocal tremors. I felt no sympathetic spike in my heart rate. Pity is an emotion reserved for victims of unpredictable circumstance. Victoria was not a victim. She was a willing beneficiary of my erasure. She wore the imported silk gowns while I worked graveyard shifts. She drank vintage champagne while I ate cheap noodles. She reaped the dividends of my stolen inheritance and felt no remorse until the invoice came due. I did not call her back. Engaging in a verbal dialogue provides a narcissist with ammunition. It gives them a surface to push against. I preferred to let her fall through empty air. I drafted a single text message to her prepaid number. I did not include a greeting or a warning. I copied a specific hyperlink from my web browser and pasted it into the text box. I hit send. The link did not route her to a bank transfer or a luxury housing portal. The link directed her to the enrollment page for a certified nursing assistant training program operating within the Dallas Municipal District. I chose that specific application with surgical intent. The role of a certified nursing assistant represents the antithesis of Victoria's entire identity. It requires grueling, unglamorous physical labor. The job involves emptying bedpans, bathing elderly patients, and cleaning up bodily fluids. It mandates 12-hour shifts, standing on hard floors for wages that barely crest above the poverty line. It demands empathy, submission, and extreme endurance. It forces a person to serve others rather than demanding to be served. It is the exact kind of manual labor she had mocked my entire life. Victoria did not respond to the text message. I knew she looked at the link and felt a surge of profound revulsion. She believed she was inherently above wearing scrubs and performing healthcare maintenance. Her ego refused to process the reality of her market value. But hunger and impending homelessness are strict educators. They do not care about a fragile ego. When the eviction notice was finally taped to her apartment door, Victoria realized no white knight was coming to save her. Stripped of her unearned prestige and desperate for cash to buy basic groceries, she was forced to seek employment. Her resume was entirely blank. She had no corporate skills, no degree, and no political network left to exploit. Through the quiet efficiency of public employment records, I monitored her descent. She did not take the nursing assistant job. Her pride prevented her from entering the healthcare sector. Instead, she accepted the only position willing to hire an adult with zero work history. She secured an entry-level retail position at a generic suburban mall on the outskirts of Dallas. The shift in her environment was a brutal mathematical correction. The velvet pedestals of the bridal boutique were permanently replaced by scuffed linoleum floors. The imported silk gowns were replaced by a synthetic polyester uniform shirt bearing a corporate logo. She was assigned to the stockroom and the sales floor. She spent 10 hours a day on her feet, unpacking heavy cardboard boxes and folding discounted inventory. The fluorescent lights overhead offered no flattering angles. She was forced to answer to shift managers who were 5 years younger than her. When she complained about her feet aching, she was told to clock out and go home without pay. When she rolled her eyes at a demanding customer, she was issued a formal written warning. She was treated as an interchangeable utility. The golden child illusion shattered completely under the harsh glare of retail reality. She learned that her curated aesthetic possessed zero currency in the actual economy. Customers snapped their fingers at her, expecting immediate service. They spoke down to her, treating her like a secondary citizen. She was experiencing the exact treatment she and my parents had subjected me to for 2 decades. She was finally learning what it felt like to be invisible. The universe balanced its ledger with flawless precision. The parasite was forced to generate its own sustenance. The structural correction was severe, but it was the only way to cure the rot. I turned my attention away from the digital records and focused back on my corporate accounts. The battlefield was clear. The adversaries were neutralized by their own incompetence. I prepared to close the final chapter of my past, setting the stage for my ultimate assessment of the war. I stood on the private terrace of my Houston penthouse, letting the warm Gulf Coast breeze wash over me. The city below was a sprawling grid of lights, an endless network of ambition and commerce. The ambient noise of the traffic rose 42 stories, creating a steady white noise that insulated my sanctuary. The chaotic frequency of my past was miles away, replaced by a profound structural quiet. The ledger was officially closed. The Internal Revenue Service had completed their seizure protocols. Richard was working the graveyard shift at a logistics warehouse, sweating under fluorescent lights to pay rent on a decaying apartment. Sylvia was entirely isolated, stripped of her country club influence, and relegated to the shadows. Victoria was folding discounted inventory in a suburban mall, learning the brutal mechanics of minimum wage survival. They were trapped in the exact scarcity they had used to control me. The universe had executed a flawless mathematical correction. I rested my hands on the glass railing of the terrace, looking out at the empire I had built. I thought about the man who set the initial trap. Grandpa William was a pragmatist who understood the corrosive nature of unearned wealth. I realized that his ultimate gift to me was not the $3 million. The capital was merely the bait. His true legacy was the meticulously engineered mechanism designed to expose the rot infecting his bloodline. He knew I needed to see their depravity in high definition. He knew the betrayal had to be absolute to break the trauma bond holding me captive. He sacrificed a fortune to purchase my freedom, ensuring that the people who viewed me as a utility were permanently severed from my future. He gave me the exact blueprint I needed to understand that blood is a biological accident, but loyalty is a conscious choice. I turned away from the skyline and looked inside my penthouse. The space was sparse, secure, and entirely mine. I had not just survived the sabotage of my family, I had replaced them. I built my own boardroom. I secured my own wealth. The corporate partners I worked alongside respected my intellect and rewarded my output. I operated within a true meritocracy where performance dictated value and manipulation was instantly audited. The people-pleasing daughter who used to shrink to keep the peace was dead. In her place stood a forensic accountant who dealt exclusively in verified reality. If you are listening to this and you recognize the architecture of my story in your own life, I need you to hear this final clinical assessment. If you are the scapegoat in a family that worships a golden child, if you are the structural pillar holding up a house built on lies, you must understand your market value. Toxic individuals do not love you. They love the resources they can extract from you. They view your empathy as a vulnerability and your competence as a threat. Never bankrupt your own spirit to fund someone else's delusion. Society places a heavy burden on the concept of family, insisting that biological ties demand unconditional surrender. That is a manipulative myth designed to keep victims compliant. When the people who are supposed to protect you view you only as an ATM walking away, is not an act of betrayal. It is a mandatory requirement for your survival. You do not owe your future to individuals who treat your existence as an inconvenience. You are not obligated to negotiate with parasites. If you find yourself trapped in a similar dynamic, do not engage in emotional warfare. Do not try to reason with arrogance and do not warn them of your departure. Build your fortress in total silence. Secure your documents, lock down your finances, and establish an impenetrable digital perimeter. Gather your undeniable proof, recording every transgression and photographing every lie. Bide your time. Wait for the exact moment when their manufactured illusion requires your capital to survive. Then drop the receipts, present the unvarnished facts, and watch the facade shatter. You do not need to orchestrate their ruin. Arrogance and greed are self-destructing mechanisms. If you simply step aside and remove yourself as their safety net, they will inevitably orchestrate their own spectacular downfall. The journey will isolate you at first. It will require a ruthless clinical focus, but I promise you the view from the fortress you build with your own hands is worth every ounce of the struggle. Thank you for staying with me until the ledger was balanced. If this narrative resonated with you, please take a moment to engage with this content. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below. Let me know if you have ever had to execute a hostile takeover of your own life. Your stories are the data points that prove we are not alone in this fight, and I read every single one. Until next time, keep your borders secure, deal only in facts, and never apologize for protecting your empire. It has been 3 years since I drove away from that frozen hospital parking lot, leaving my father standing alone in the snow. The Texas sun is warm today, and from my Houston penthouse, I can see a horizon entirely of my own making. The war is over, and the ledger is closed. Surviving my family was the most brutal yet necessary education I could have received. I learned that blood does not demand loyalty, it only explains your biology. True loyalty is a conscious choice found in those who hold the perimeter when the wolves arrive, not in those who throw you to them. I also learned never to bankrupt my own spirit to fund someone else's delusion. When the people supposed to protect you view you merely as a utility, walking away is not a betrayal, it is an act of absolute survival. You cannot heal in the environment that made you sick. Finally, I learned that silence is the ultimate power move. You do not need to argue with arrogance or debate your worth with parasites. Build your fortress in the quiet drop, the undeniable receipts when the time is right, and let toxic individuals orchestrate their own spectacular downfall. If you are the forgotten sibling, the glass child, or the utility player in your family, stop setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. You have the right to build a locked door and curate your own peace. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, Please like, subscribe, and share your experiences in the comments below. This is Senior Echo Stories reminding you that your legacy is entirely up to you.